Hello, everybody. I think we should begin. We are so fortunate to have the talented and experienced people among us that we do, living at Horizon House and beyond and available to us. It's made putting together programs for Let's Talk Science a pleasure. And one of the best is Grant Hildebrand, who recently talked to us about Frank Lloyd Wright, and today will tell us things that I certainly never knew or understood about the Capitol in Olympia and how special it is. I want to just say briefly before we begin that we as a committee are participating in the Earth Day, now Earth Month, maybe Earth Year, who knows, celebrations that are coming ahead. So you should expect special announcements about particular programs and series ahead that will occupy us really through early May. I'm looking forward to those as well. So Grant, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Our state capitol is the finest, I think, of the classically styled state capitals throughout the country. I've looked at all 50, and I'm prepared to show you why I think that is so. It's also said to be the fourth largest masonry dome in the world, and we're going to be talking about that aspect of the Capitol in some detail. The story begins with statehood, 1889, and the divvying up of the different amenities that the state had to offer. The university, the Capitol. Seattle made a bid for the Capitol and named a hill after it. Our Capitol Hill was an attempt to sway the decision on that score, but it went to Olympia, and not entirely a consensus. There was considerable controversy about its location for quite some time, especially the people in Tacoma had felt that they had a strong case, and they continued to, if I might put it that way, hassle the issue. But it goes to Olympia, and in 1893, a competition is held to design the state capitol building. 188 submissions, amazing. They ran the range of quality. Quite a number were near copies of other capitals. Colorado seemed to be a favorite. Several looked very much like Buckingham Palace. And the decision, out of this tremendous number of submissions, the decision went to Ernest Flagg. Flagg's proposal was a relatively modest design. It fit the budget, which was spelled out in some detail, and it was convincing to those who made the decision, and the trenches were dug and foundations were laid. But 1893 was a poor year, a disastrous year for the American economy. The money didn't seem to be there, and the project was postponed. Months went by, and months became years, and there it sat in just its foundations. And in those years that came and went, things happened. In 1898, you all know the Klondike Gold Rush brought real prosperity to this region, and it brought a sense that the Flagg building was not adequate at all. It was far too small to solve the increased bureaucratic business of the state. And other things happened that you will know. Henry Matthews described to you the 1893 exposition in Chicago that changed architectural tastes and lent a considerable sophistication to architectural issues. the competition had been 1893. Had it been a few years later, it would have reflected that influence, but coming at the same time, it couldn't take that into account. And we all know that 1909 was the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition here, in which John Galen Howard controlled the design of a Renaissance-based exposition in Seattle. We all are familiar with that, I think. And these things changed architectural taste, lent it, as I've said, a sophistication that it hadn't really had in 1893, and it made a demand for a much larger kind of provision facility. The site is a salient that projects into the southern reaches of Puget Sound. It is elevated above the water by a considerable degree. The edges are a bluff, and at its base, of course, is a railroad track. The railroads claimed the best of the land throughout our country. They claimed the waterfront in Olympia, and the site necessarily overlooked those tracks. This time around, there were 30 entries, a much more manageable number. And of that 30, well, I should say there were two aspects to the competition. One was a competition for a campus that would have at its center the legislative building. And the second competition was for a Supreme Court building called the Temple of Justice. These were quite separate, but both were won by the same firm. The firm was Wilder and White. Wilder and White. Walter Wilder and Harry Wright. And they had been working for McKim, Mead and White, which was the dean of architectural firms in the country at the time. It set the standard, almost all would agree, it set the standard for the quality of the American Renaissance, in which style it designed. So Wilder and White won the competition and came to us from New York and from that office. What would they have been doing and by the way, Stanford White was shot in 1906, as some of you may know, and the White of our firm was not related in any way. They would have worked on one state capital, Rhode Island, and most importantly, they would have worked on the New York station for the Pennsylvania Railroad, Penn Station. This is a project that has tremendous influence on our state capital, and I'm going to talk about some of its details later, but for the moment, let's just take a look at it. We think of buildings as having walls. Horizon House has walls and Virginia Mason and your home. Here the wall has been made irrelevant. It is a colonnade, essentially, with a slightly wider opening at the center. You may see it there. And the end pavilions, which are passageways for vehicular traffic. Very unusual when you think about it. Very few urban buildings have this kind of facade. And in fact, Penn Station had the more conventional wall at its sides. My mouth is dry as chalk. I don't know why, and it's causing me to stumble. And it was a magnificent project inside, modeled on the baths of Caracalla, the great Roman baths. Grand space, grand scale. You see the people, and the stairway at the right is the entry. You came in from the street down those stairs, and in the distance on axis is the vehicular access. The vehicles would have come through those little dark spaces and up into this, and then off to the left would have been the tracks, the wonderful cast iron track structure. This was Wilder and White's training, and it could hardly have been a more magnificent training. This would have been an experience that would have been unequaled, unsurpassed. So they came to us, and they made their proposal for the campus and for the Temple of Justice. You see them both here. The dome is, of course, the legislative building. The nearest building, I think, is insurance, part of the campus plan that they proposed. And beyond the domed building, between it and the water, is the Temple of Justice. This was the first thing to have been built, but it took a while. More politics, more hassling about Tacoma, and finally, in, I think, 1917, it finally began. You see it here. What is it? You will remember the colonnade of the Penn Station. This builds upon it. And where did that come from? I think it came from here. This, I think, is its distant ancestor, a building that is entirely a colonnade. This is Bernini's Piazza of St. Peter's in Rome, entirely a colonnade. And I think one could argue, and I'm going to, that this flattened out became Penn Station. The columns are, I think, a direct reflection of that influence. I think that McKim was looking here at Bernini's great piazza and seeing in it an urbanity that was statuesque, lively, magnificent. And from this, you can see very directly the Temple of Justice. I think that Wilder and White, having worked on that Penn Station design, have employed it here to awfully good purpose. Then there is the main campus and the legislative building. And on this we're going to be spending a good bit of time. I thought I'd show you what the competition was in terms of design of state capitals. This is Texas. And it's a mess. The lower floor, those little arcaded openings down at the base, a wretched little... And above are 4 columns that support a pediment that reaches up to a ordinary story of something or other, and well, I'll be merciful and leave it at that. This is a much higher level of quality. This is McKim, Mead, and White, and you can see here that we're dealing here with a far more sophisticated design. The central portico and the dome above, the wings for Senate and House, respectively. But now let's turn to Olympia. Do you see the quality? It has a presence, a stature that is unique to it. And it's achieved by turning again to those colonnades of Penn Station and the Temple of Justice and Bernini, if you like. Wilder and White here have created a central portico and the Senate and House wings in which they flow into one another, and they have observed another rather nice detail. Sorry, I want to go back. McKim here has done rather an odd thing. He's used an odd number of columns in that portico with the pediment above, and this means that a column occurs on center line, and the Greeks never did this because they had a processional path that would work axially, and therefore an even number of columns which would create an opening on center rather than as here a column. And Wilder and White have observed that nicety. They've done an 8-column facade that yields an opening at center, and then the, I think, beautiful handling of the wings. But the dome here is big. You can sense it here. If we look at McKim's scheme, you'll notice the triangular pediment and the top of it, the ridge, and it's just a smidgen above that we find the columns of the drum of the dome. The dome is almost begins at the ridge of the pediment. Look now at Washington. The columns of the dome are way above that pediment, way above it. Why? They had two reasons. One was that they felt the dome ought to be a dome for the campus and not just the building. They wanted it to give a sense of centrality to the building grouping, and then to Washington is a vast territory compared to Rhode Island, and the dome was seen as something that should count at a distance, should give an identity seen from the roads and the byways of the state. I-5, I think, does not quite play the same game. It doesn't see it quite as the earlier streets would have done, but you see the point. It's a large dome, and it's large for reasons. Here it is. Where does it come from? The earliest dome that we can find in architectural history is the Treasury Atrius at Mycenae, but I'm not going to deal with that. It's subterranean and it hardly counts in the story, but the Pantheon certainly does count. Here the idea of dome begins in force. Many of you have seen this, I suppose. Many of you must know it. Architect, probably Hadrian, reigned from 117 to 138, and this was probably done in the 130s. It is a fantastic design. You see the dome up there with its coffers, its recesses. All that would have had to be built in wood to pour the concrete. You must have a form on which to pour the concrete, and that would have had to be built all in wood. Can you imagine that? An enormous wood construction on which this dome was poured, and it introduces the question of stresses in a dome, the strength of the thing. A dome has within it forces that are not spherical. A section through a dome will yield a force line that is rather a parabola. That is, as it descends, it keeps moving outward, And a dome will tend then to collapse at the haunches if it's not adequately provided for. And here in the Pantheon, provided for in a couple ways. You see here in section that if on the right you look at the sectional cut, the dome comes down and then is widened at the haunch. There is material there that gives the roof of the thing not a domical shape, but rather a cup. And as you move downward, the mass, the concrete, moves outward. So the weight of the thing is borne not entirely by the total wall below, but rather by its outer edges, and the Romans understood this. What you see here in plan is a wall that is really concentrated at its outer edges. You see the chapels that have been cut into the plan right around the periphery. This helps the design in another way. Concrete will not cure if it's simply a large mass of material. Concrete doesn't dry, it cures chemically, and it must be in relatively concise mass to do so. The Hoover Dam was poured in a whole series of refrigerator-sized pores, small pores to cure well. And here the Romans have kept their mass constrained so the concrete will cure properly. Wise people. Vitruvius left, writing in the time of Augustus, left the recipe for making concrete, and the Romans used it right the way through the empire. Then it disappears, of course, until the 19th century. We don't find it again, although the recipe was there right the way through. Well, Hadrian's Pantheon. Many of you will know this building, Florence, the Cathedral of Florence, Santa Maria del Fiore, preoccupied with circular windows. I never quite understood why. This may count as a dome or not. It's actually an octagonal shape, as you see. Arnolfo de Cambio, who did the substructure, left this unanswered, and there was a long period in which competitions for the design of the dome were tried and rejected. Finally, Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi competed, and Brunelleschi won the day, and this is his design. It is the subject of a book simply entitled Brunelleschi's Dome by Ross King. It's a wonderful book, and if some of you have read it, you may agree with me. If not, and you're interested in this, you might look it up. Brunelleschi's Dome by Ross King. Brunelleschi figured out a way to do this without the elaborate substructure that was necessary for the Pantheon. He did it by building the dome in essentially two layers, one inside the other, so that as it proceeded upward, there was always a kind of working platform of the two different walls of the dome, and so it proceeded upward, and it assumes a shape in itself that is much closer to a parabola, so the forces here are much more in accord with the profile of the dome itself. Then yes, this is a diagram of Brunelleschi's scheme, ribs, octagon. The same dimension as the Pantheon, 149 feet across. Then, having finished the dome itself, Brunelleschi had to compete again for the lantern. He competed again with Ghiberti, which didn't make him happy. But he won the design. This is the lantern as we see it. And this we rather take for granted now, but this is its first appearance in a domical application. We think now of it as an ordinary feature, but it happens here first with Brunelleschi and at Florence. those round windows, I've always wondered about those. They're very difficult to make. They went to considerable effort to achieve that, and I wonder why. Then, of course, Michelangelo's great dome at St. Peter's. Michelangelo wanted the vertical. He wanted that upward thrust. The profile, again, not too far off parabola, and the parabolic descent of the force curve. You can almost read it here. You see how it's coming downward into those columns that project outward, and all is vertical. Paired columns supporting a double rib that leads upward. Wonderful energy to the thing. Michelangelo felt the guts of a architectural problem, and the lantern that continues the doubled columns that we found below, rising to the orb. This is a dome over a square. How do you make a dome fit a square? You use pendentives. If you imagine cutting an orange in half and cutting 4 sides, you have a pendentive dome. If you slice the top off the thing and put a smaller half orange on top of it, you have a dome on pendentives. And here it is in its early usage at Hagia Sophia in what was then Constantinople. Do you see the pendentives, those triangular forms that lead down from the dome to a square support the piers of the church? And here it is at St. Peter's. The pendentives here much larger, more they've lost their triangular character. Dome on pendentives. This will have an importance for our state capital. St. Paul's, London. I like this photo. It's during the raids of the Luftwaffe. The smoke is from the pounding of the city, and the dome of St. Paul's rising above it. It always seemed to me to be a rather Churchillian kind of image. This hardly counts as a masonry dome. I'm including it because it's hard to leave it out, but it isn't really a masonry construction. And whereas Michelangelo wanted the vertical, here it's the horizontal that dominates. And it is different from St. Peter's in including the side aisles within the dome. And this comes from the handling of the octagon at Ely Cathedral. What am I doing? I'm not getting any action here. I'm not able to advance the slide. Yes. Christopher Wren, of course, was the architect of St. Paul's. If you seek his monument, look around you. And his uncle was bishop at Ely. And Ely had had the dome collapsing in the mid-1300s and had rebuilt it with this wonderful octagonal wooden construction that embraced not just the main nave and choir, but the side aisles as well. And Wren borrows this idea for his dome at St. Paul's. We'll see the interior in a moment, but you can see here that the dome reaches out over the entirety of the breadth of the nave. You can also see here a couple other interesting things. If you look at the nave, the lower part of the building in this picture, you can see that the side walls are dummies, and within them are flying buttresses that support the nave of St. Paul's. Few people know that, and it's seldom pointed out. And then up above, perhaps you can see, it's a little hard to make it out, around the lantern there is a void. The dome surface does not quite reach the lantern, and this is used to bring light into Wren's dome. But the dome itself, here the lantern, and perhaps you can make out that those ribs do not quite touch the lantern base. It's a little hard to see, but perhaps you can make it out. All horizontals. But this is 3 domes, really. There's an outer dome, which is quite thin and is basically a metal structure. And then there's that conical piece, do you see it, that's to support the weight of the lantern independently, that conical form that comes down. And then the interior, which is quite a separate thing altogether. 3 quite separate domes, very different in their altitude, as you see. And here we have pendentives all over the place, necessitated by the inclusion of the side aisles. Well, here we are back to Olympia. Wilder and White here, it seems to me, have combined both the vertical of St. Peter's and the horizontal of Wren's St. Paul's. The dome is just at the base of the curved structure itself is bounded by an uninterrupted ring, and below that they have done that emphasis on the paired columns that create the separate panels, really, of the base. It's kind of having it both ways. I'm not sure that's the most successful feature of the design, but you can see here what they're trying to do. And it caps, of course, this, I think, superb building. It is it is remarkable also in the use to which Wilder and White have put this opportunity. We're looking here obviously at the interior. You can see the pendentives that lead down to bring the dome to its square underpinnings. And if you look at right, you see that there's a stair leading up into this space. And then the same at left. These are the entries from the exterior. And then ahead is a stair that leads us up to either the House or the Senate. This is really quite something. You don't find this at St. Peter's or St. Paul's, certainly not at the Pantheon. This is a deployment of the domical opportunity that strikes me as brilliant. It's a beautiful idea. It brings the dome into an actual usage in terms of the design scheme. The project was not entirely completed. This got in here wrongly, and I'm sorry about that. That's St. Peter's. The project was not entirely completed when the crash, the 1929 crash hit. The project was not quite done, and tools were put down, and it was left almost finished, but not quite. And where is my hat? This is my Bud Shore Memorial hat. It's the hat that Bud always wore, and I enjoyed it and bought one just like it. Bud Shore was brought in the 1980s with other teams to finish the work, to give it its final finish coloration. and it is glorious in its postmodern colors, I think. Mike Spafford, of course, did the mural for the Senate that was rejected and removed. Contention seems always to have surrounded this building. So, our state capitol. The dome, oversized as you see, but meant to serve the campus and the distance. The Temple of Justice, seen there in the beyond the legislative building. The design had a problem that you can see here resolved. It had to either turn its back on the sound or turn its back on the city or have two facades, and it does. It has a front and a back that respect both the urban setting beyond and the sound to the north. And I think that we should be grateful to its builders. They have left us, I think, a building in which we should take pride and feel gratitude. We should also feel a gratitude toward Norman Johnston, friend, colleague, and fellow resident late among us. Norman wrote the definitive book on the Capitol, from which I've drawn considerable information for this talk. He did a scholarly job of it. If you know Norm, you would have expected no less. We owe him gratitude as well. Thank you, Norman, and thank you all for listening to my account of this Capitol, and I'm glad to discuss any part of it you might like.
Hey, we're good. Grant, I noticed not only in the Penn State building, but in all the other buildings, why the emphasis on height? Everything seems to be up.
Why the emphasis on height?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question I've never pondered.
Well,
Tell me about it.
Give it some thought sometime.
Yeah. Why is that? I have no ready answer for that one. I could reframe the question. That's the usual professorial approach to these things, but no, I don't know what to tell you about that. No, what can I say with regard to that?
Grant,
The building cannot be low. Somehow that just doesn't work, does it? Excuse me, you had a question?
Sorry, no, I just
Yeah.
wanted to make a comment because
Yeah.
when I looked at the Penn Station and the huge volume
Yes,
in
it is,
comparison
yeah,
to the
yeah.
teeny tiny ants
Yeah.
being humans.
Yes.
When I was still in a Catholic school in Europe,
Yeah.
and I remember that topic came up for whatever reason because, you know,
The idea of size.
the size, right, and the human in this building.
Yeah.
The answer was that God is so huge, basically, that God is so powerful that we human beings have to take into consideration that we really are nothing. We are just these tiny things in this huge volume of whatever it is.
So the Penn Station is
diminishing the ego of the human
the
being.
ego of the human. I don't know. It has a grandeur. There's no question of that. It's hard to imagine this building. We're looking here at Norman, the Capitol. It's hard to imagine it as a lower sort of thing, isn't it? There's sense. Perhaps it's simply tradition or familiarity. I don't know. The grandeur of the Penn Station space is, of course, an astonishing thing. It was demolished, and its demolition led to the entire preservation movement. In demolishing it, we lost one of the grand buildings of our country. But the question of size, I'd have to ponder that. Yeah. Interesting question. Yeah.
A friend of mine at William Sloane Coffin, a minister, talked about how large religious buildings has become.
Yeah.
And his conclusion was that many ministers have an edifice complex.
Ha ha ha. Clever.
I want to just say something very briefly, not only about what I learned, but about your teaching. What I learned today were a lot of facts that were very interesting and productive of my own thinking. The most important thing was a new way of looking that I will carry forward from now on at looking at many other buildings. I think it's great teaching when it opens your eyes and minds to things that you might not have thought of otherwise. And that's what I feel about what happened today.
That's good of you to say, Andy. I feel that that's the role of teaching, is to open eyes and see things in new ways. I watched with Bill on Wednesday night. We watched the movie Dead Poets Society, and his view was to look at things in different and new ways, and I was very touched by that film. It's a fine film. Yeah.
I might offer a little insight into the why up. Up is always good, down is always bad.
Yeah.
We have highs and lows, ups and downs,
Yeah.
and nobody ever competes for breadth. Nobody tries to outdo the Pentagon in how much space you occupy, but countries still keep trying to build something taller than somebody else.
Yeah.
And what we see in this is a constant theme, I think, throughout human existence, and expresses itself magnificently in architecture, as you've just demonstrated. But good is up, down is bad,
Yeah.
and forever it shall be.
I think you commented once also about, I'm trying to find my control here. I think you commented once also, Gordon, about elevators and red buttons and red being danger, which is a bit obvious, I suppose, from fire. But yeah, down is bad. But looking at this, I can't really imagine it as a smaller, lower building. It has a presence that says governance is important, and it deserves an expression.
Grant, how do architects decide about the relative weight to be put on grandeur and utilitarian features? For example, the Pentagon.
Is your mic on? I'm not sure it is.
Hold it up to your mouth.
How do architects decide how much weight to put on grandeur on the one hand and utilitarian features on the other, as perhaps exemplified by Penn Station or the Pentagon?
I'll tell you what
Does it come from the person who pays the bill?
I'll tell you what I think, and it relates again back to that film. I think that going into Penn Station as it was does something to ennoble us. And you go through Penn Station now, it's the height of this room. It goes on forever, and it's the height of this room. And for all that I think this room is rather a nice thing, it doesn't do the same thing for us, I think, as that Penn Station space did. That's a romanticism. I freely admit that. I think walking into a space like that, we become something rather different. I think that's a measure of poetry, of music. When we encounter something of that sort, we hear Dvorak's cello concerto, or we read Wordsworth's Ode, I think we become a little different. And if we don't, that effort has failed us. It should do that. That's what life is it not? Yes.
Grant, thank you for showing us the roots of the state capitol building in Olympia, which go back to antiquity, and then looking at Renaissance times and things of that nature. You mentioned that you rank it very highly among the 50 capitals. I was wondering what you think of some of the buildings that were built immediately after it, and I'm thinking of ones that are not influenced by the classical style, like including Oregon and Nebraska. And I know it's too bad I don't have a picture to illustrate what I mean, but they're a new style not rooted in classicism.
Yes, there's some very fine work. I would have to go back and refresh my memory to cite the examples, but I understand what you're saying, and they do come to mind. I can't pin them down at the moment. My memory isn't working quite that well. Erwin, did I answer your question at all? I gave you a rather flowery answer, but I believe it. Yeah. 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 I think the world is a better place for having the old Penn Station as opposed to the new one.
Yes.
Yeah. I think the world is a better place for having falling water. Yeah, I believe that.
Well, why do we need a huge interior space at Penn Station? It's a symbol for this railway system which spreads out over the whole nation.
It is that, yes.
The railways were built incredibly ambitiously in the mid-19th century.
They were the only game in town.
And they need a symbolism in the city itself from which it starts.
Yeah.
I'd also like to say something about height. The Pantheon is in a way a bit disappointing. Its interior is absolutely unparalleled, one of the most inspiring spaces in the world. But outside you get a portico which was designed for an earlier temple that never was finished. And you don't see the dome of the Pantheon unless you're in certain places where it's not very easy to be. Yes. But St. Paul's, St. Peter's, the Washington State Capitol are seen from all over their cities.
Yes.
And they speak to us.
They do indeed. That's a nice point, Henry. The Pantheon, you say disappointment. Yes, one wouldn't know the grandeur of the interior from the mundane exterior, really. It's not a very fascinating thing from the exterior at all. The portico is huge, but the contrast, well, I'll leave it at that, I think, for the moment on the Pantheon. But yes, it is a disappointment. And this building that you have on the screen is not. The exterior, I think, has a grandeur that is commensurate with the interior, don't you think? Say yes.
Yes. Very strong. So many state capitals, all lots of little pieces joined together. And this one seems to have a coherence.
It does indeed. Coherence, yes, is a good word. Yeah, it does. I like it so much.
Grant, I have a rather picky question about that Penn Station design. You say that there were openings for vehicles to come into the station? I mean,
At the sides.
automobiles?
Yeah, at the sides of the station, they descend and come along the edge of the thing, and then feed from there into the Grand Central Gallery.
Why would automobiles be coming into the station where pedestrians were walking?
I don't understand your point.
These are cars, automobiles?
Yeah, yeah.
To come.
Taxis, yeah.
Oh, they're driveways to drop people off, is what
Yes,
you're saying. I
yeah,
understand. Thank you.
Yeah, right. Yes.
You failed to mention that Norm's father was the
Quite right. Thank you.
he got
Yes.
mentioned.
Norm's father, Jay Johnston, was the construction manager throughout the construction of the Capitol. And thank you. I certainly should have mentioned that. It's in my notes, and I didn't read them carefully. Thank you much. Yes, Jay Johnston was a key figure, and Norman grew up in the shadows of the construction of the Capitol. I hope many of you here knew Norman. He's a wonderful man. I liked him so much, so very much. Yeah.
Any other further questions?
Yes, Irwin. Yeah.
This is probably silly, but all of this brings to mind the question of what is beauty.
Yes.
I mean, we talk about the Penn Station idea, the dome idea. If you go very close to home, here in Seattle, and look at the University of Washington,
Yeah.
the Quad is a very beautiful
Yes.
place,
Yeah.
as is the plaza in front of the library at the University of Washington,
Yes.
and the whole concept of being able to see Mount Rainier.
Yeah.
So that it may be that the question I asked was too simplistic, because there's the more basic question of what makes something beautiful.
What makes something beautiful? Again, the film we watched the other evening, I've pondered what the answer to that is throughout my life. Many of us have. And I gave an answer to Bill that is stupid. It doesn't take us very far, and yet it's as far as I've got. My measure is, does the thing have life? And then you say, well, what does that mean? And I grant you it doesn't mean a lot, except it does. When I read a poem and it's alive to me, I know that I've read a poem. I'm getting into some things that I don't often say here, but I'm happy to say them. It sounds good to say them. That's how I feel. Yeah, if a thing has life, and this has life, this to me is an architecture that lives, thought lay behind it, and taste and a sense of propriety, appropriateness, many things. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those questions. Yeah.
I'll quote a couple of lines from Wordsworth, which may have some bearing on what is beauty. Earth hath not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. That is the opening lines of a poem written from Westminster Bridge.
I give you the opening lines of a poem I've cited in my own work, and which Gordon Orions will find comfortable. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream.
Bravo.
Thank you for listening to some rather, subjective comments. I think I was speaking from the heart a little more today than I usually do, and that feels good. Yeah.
And thank you very much, Grant. Pleasure. Thank you.